to the Halloween special of the Book, Line, and Sinker podcast. There are so many great horror writers and horror movies, but one of the most interesting spooky writers is none other than Edgar Allan Poe. His poems and short stories are classics in American literature, so we are going to discuss the disturbed writer and one of his most creepy stories. I have Brittany with me today, and we're just going to dive into Edgar Allan Poe.
Hey everybody!
So horror hasn't really been accepted in American film and literature, till recently. And it's rarely seen as a classic or award-worthy. But Edgar Allan Poe has been around since the early 1800s, and he's been semi-respected since his death. So I just want to discuss how he's impacted so much of modern horror and kind of just about him in general. When were you introduced to Edgar Allan Poe?
I was introduced to him in high school. I was probably in 7th grade, and we read The Raven, one of his most famous poems, and I loved it. And so I actually went out on my own and I read some more of his poetry. And then we read The Telltale Heart in class, and I was obsessed with that story. I thought it was so creepy, so fun, and there were so many metaphors that he has in his short stories and the literature that he writes. It's just so crazy and so good, so spooky. It's kind of interesting that you talk about, things that impact literature. His detective and, the Murder in the Rue Morgue story, that was kind of what founded the modern detective mystery novel, which is kind of crazy. His person is basically Sherlock Holmes.
I was going to say, well, people think that Sherlock Holmes has influenced the detective, but author Conan Doyle actually said that Edgar Allan Poe was his inspiration. So Poe was the original that kind of brought Sherlock to life, which brought so many detectives to life.
Very popular genre.
And it's been interesting to see in just really recent history how Edgar Allan Poe has influenced television, especially with the big show that Kevin Bacon was in, The Following, where the murderers had a cult and their saint was Edgar Allan Poe, and they were inspired to kill
My mom
from
was
Poe's literature.
obsessed with that show. She loved it.
It was really interesting. I mean, it had a good cast. It's like a resurgence of Edgar Allan Poe every 50 years comes about. And he's just really influenced horror novels and horror movies and shows to this day. Which is interesting because he was kind of, this is a harsh word, but pathetic in his own life.
He wasn't wimpy.
He wasn't respected. His literature and stuff didn't really take off till after his death. He was born poor, he died poor. His life in itself, it was not that long. I mean, much longer than the other people in his life that kept dying. But it was just kind of depressing. And I think we distance ourselves from the actual Poe, from his literature, because we just see him as immortal, kind of like this god of horror, of spooky, but people didn't really see him that way until recently. One of my favorite things, though, is the most famous thing about Poe is his death. And I hear you have some conspiracy theories.
Okay, so I did some research before we started this because there are a lot of theories about how he died. And I even found some stuff that I had never even heard before. So my favorite theory I'll start with is called cooping.
Yes! Oh my gosh, I wrote one of my favorites.
Yes! So it blows my mind. But the fact that maybe he was, drugged or plied with alcohol and made to vote a certain way because that particular day was a day that you could vote. And then, just left stranded on the street. But the crazy thing about his death that makes everyone think that it wasn't just alcohol poisoning or something just generic is the fact that, first of all, he disappeared for 5 days. No one knew where he was. And he was wandering around the street delirious in what were someone else's clothes.
Mm-hmm.
because that's not what he normally would have wore, or something reflective of his class.
I just want to let our listeners know, so the definition of cooping, that I got this from Smithsonian Magazine, is a method of voter fraud practiced by gangs in the 19th century where an unsuspecting victim would be kidnapped, disguised, and forced to vote for a specific candidate multiple times under multiple disguised identities. So this was like a thing.
Yeah.
It kind of, actually, that one made the most sense to me. Like, it explains his disappearance, it explains his different clothes. He was found in a place that coopers often brought their victims. Mm-hmm. According to the Smithsonian, that's where I'm getting all of this, so haven't done that much research.
Yeah.
But that was interesting. Another one of my favorite one was rabies.
Oh, yes.
Like, okay.
What an interesting way to die. Apparently, like, that was a wide epidemic at the time, which is crazy, but I mean, it makes sense. They didn't have any kind of vaccines, and it spread quickly because everywhere was dirty and there were animals everywhere, so.
Yeah. It could have been alcohol, alcohol poisoning, but that's just not a lot of fun.
No.
And that doesn't explain the 5 days.
Or why he was in someone else's clothes. Unless he just got, like, really, really drunk.
Yeah, some other ones that were interesting was that he was, like, poisoned by heavy metal or carbon
mercury.
monoxide.
Mm-hmm.
What did they say? They found mercury in Poe's hair that was 30 times below the level consistent with mercury poison.
I think I looked at the same site that you did.
Yeah, so study.
Yeah.
Like, so they disproved a lot of these. I'm just going to go through and read what it could be. So there's a lot of conspiracies around his death. Some say he was beaten. Some say it was alcohol. Some say it was poisoning. All of those have kind of been disproved to a point in modern history or modern research. Brain tumor was one of them, the flu, and then murder. Oh yeah, I love this one. It was said that he could have been murdered by the brothers of his wealthy fiancée, Elmira Shelton.
I heard that too.
And that's kind of interesting. I don't know, I'm just looking for a story. I'm like, I wish it was...
It's gotta be more.
Fun.
It's gotta be something more.
I mean, not really. He died, but it was...
It's interesting.
Yeah, it is 1849. I feel like we've reached the point where we can not joke about it, but be intrigued by it like it was a mystery.
Yeah.
Today, I want to talk about... We can talk about more of his short stories or his poems, but I think one of the most brilliant and intriguing stories, which is actually one of his later short stories, is the Cask of Amontillado.
That is my favorite story.
It's the best one. I think what is so intriguing about this story is how unrelatable is how unreliable the narrator is, while at the same time like giving great detail about a murder he committed 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And just the hatred that is still brewing.
I want to know what this guy did. What did this guy do?
According to the main character, so we'll just give an overview. The characters are Montresor and Fortunato. And Fortunato has apparently given Montresor, I think that's how I say it. If I'm wrong, come to the library, correct me. I'm going to keep saying it. But apparently Fortunato has said an insult so horrible that Montresor is going to get revenge on him by burying him alive.
I need to know what this insult is. What did this guy say to make him just snap like that?
Yeah, and I think that's
what most scares me, because it's like either he's had a very, very bad couple of weeks, or this was just absolutely the worst thing that you could say.
I know. I think that's what makes it kind of so scary and interesting to read. Why is it your favorite?
I just love the fact that he lured him down there and he was so, committed, because he, plied him with wine. He was, talking a big game, talking with him. And he had this plan in mind all along. So he knew when he saw him, he was like, I'm going to bury this guy alive, but I'm going to pretend to be his friend. I'm going to get him some wine. We're going to go down here. And then just slowly, one by one, breaking him in. And keeping with that resolve, not breaking. That's what scares me.
I think it's funny, like, how drunk he makes Fortunato, like, out to be and how silly. So it's like he's almost justifying, like, this guy is an idiot. He deserved this. And my favorite part is that this story is told 50 years later. So this isn't something that just happened. Like, this guy has got away with murder for 50 years. Mm-hmm. And Fortunato is just a pile of bones in the wall. And it's just like, okay, this has happened.
I'm imagining him telling this to his grandkids on his deathbed.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. And I think what intrigues me about it is that it's 50 years in the future, and this guy was already a little bit older. Obviously, I mean, he was strong enough to bury a guy in the wall and drink and all that stuff. And people in Poe's life, like, didn't live long. So he's given, like, this long life to this evil villain, which kind of makes Poe just even more kind of creepy or spooky, because he's relating and writing about the murderer so well, and the victim is just this joker. I mean, he's in, like, a jester's costume.
Yeah.
I've become a real fan of this story. And I think one thing about Poe's stories is that the language is really accessible, despite being, almost 300 years old?
Mm-hmm. It's very easy to read, even for, middle schoolers.
Really intriguing guy. I like his poetry too, but I think his short stories are just truly the best. I would encourage everyone to read them. They're short stories, so they don't take that long. It's a great Halloween story to read. But also, I think this year has been one of the most, not profitable, but there's just been an abundance of horror literature that's come out. And it's kind of making a comeback. I remember probably back in the 90s there was a lot, but there hasn't really been a resurgence of horror literature since then.
And not even just literature, like media, movies, television, video games, all kinds of stuff out there. It's like we've become obsessed all of a sudden.
Yeah, and I've been watching this show called Eli Roth's House of Horrors, and each week he goes over kind of different genres within horror, like slashers and demons and zombies. And what he was saying was that, like, from the 30s to till The Exorcist in 1973, horror wasn't really allowed on the screen. It wasn't respected. It was something that just a stereotype, like a nerd in a basement, like, got enjoyment out of. But now it's mainstream. Anyone can love horror, and no one looks down on it. Mm-hmm. Halloween, The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, those are now respected as canon. And I think Edgar Allan Poe and writers like him made that possible in America, because they are considered classics. So we know that horror can be a classic. It can be respected. So any last thoughts on Edgar Allan Poe? Anything you want to bring up?
Just the fact that he was very, very sad. And I think that translated into his stories. Mm-hmm. His poetry especially is just, it's beautiful prose, but it's just, you can see the grief. You can see all of the stuff that he's going through in his real life, which makes everything relatable. So I think that's kind of why his poetry has endured so much.
One question I want to ask is, do you think Poe was crazy, or do you think that he was just disturbed by the events in his life? Like, not necessarily crazy, but just, like, sad.
I think anyone pushed to a certain point can become crazy. I think there's just a lot of stuff that happened in his life that, impacted him, and that takes its toll. So if he was crazy, we can't really say, but I don't think he was. I just think he was very, very depressed, and had a very sad life.
He was a little bit disturbed, but he always leaned towards poetry. Like, he didn't want to go into business like his father wanted him to. He wanted to write poetry. But I always have to think of the people that write disturbing stories, and where, if that comes from them wanting to kind of show humanity, like their own flaws, or if it comes from them being disturbed themselves.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing. You can give your thoughts or comments on our podcast page. But happy Halloween. Read some horror, watch some horror movies. The new Halloween's out. I just saw it last weekend. It was really good. Jamie Lee Curtis is fantastic as always. And we will be back next week with our author interview with Donna Marie Miller.